Deep Magic, Chapter 1, recapping the basics.
Next on Eternal Dirtles. Hello and welcome to Eternal Dirtles. I'm your host, Zach Clark, and with me as always, Phil Bleckman. Phil, how's it going, man?
Zach, I am an idiot clown, and I need to go back and learn how to actually play this game.
Yeah.
Tell me, what are we doing? What are we doing today? How are we navigating?
We're gonna start a little series here, and this is gonna include a small reading assignment for the people at home, and we'll figure out ways to make this accessible. We're working right now. We're trying to find Charles Wolfe and George H. Baxter so that we can do an audiobook version of this so people can check it out. You can get this on Amazon right now. It's like $6-7. But it's the book that got me into competitive Magic. I got this.
What book is it, Zach?
This is Deep Magic, Advanced Strategies for Experienced Magic the Gathering Players.
Wow.
So what's cool about this book is that this was sort of the first time I learned a lot of the valuable lessons that we take for granted nowadays. I think we want to approach this series as sort of pointing out some of the stuff that's very anachronistic that doesn't exactly hold up anymore in a book like this that's over almost 30 years old. But at the same time, there are some nuggets of wisdom here that I think that we can bring up and kind of discuss a little bit more fully. So you don't necessarily have to have read the book with us. It'll just increase your enjoyment a little bit, I think.
Yeah, read the book, everybody. It'll be fun.
Read the book.
It's a super easy read about something that we all enjoy. So you kind of breeze through it pretty quick.
Yeah, this is. I mean, the first chapter is 4 pages, so we're just going to do the first chapter. Hopefully, this video does well, and if it does, we'll keep doing this, and it'll be fun. It'll be something that we do as a weekly little extra thing that we try and pull out when we can. So
it's also a nice throwback. I just want to point out, I started playing pre-modern recently, and the combination of cards and the way that people were using them in the earlier days of Magic and how they can inspire ideas today. Now, an example was when I was trying to bring Parfait, which is a land tax scroll rack deck, into Legacy. Obviously, that combination is too slow. It's been power crept out, but one thing that I learned from playing Scroll Rack in my main board, even though Scroll Rack itself was underpowered, the ability to sculpt your hand without drawing cards in a Bowmasters, Narset, Hullbreacher era was actually way more. That particular interaction with those cards was noticeably powerful. Being able to just sculpt my hand with impunity, not having to care about my opponent's Bowmasters or a Narset that was on the table, was way, way better than I thought it would be, even though it was still underpowered.
Yeah.
That inspired me to think of are there ways that I can offset going down a card by going up a card? So examples were do I play a loam strategy that then can cycle those lands back on top? Loam then can mill the cards back, and then when you pick up the loam, and then you go again, and now we're just ancestraling every turn. And that's similar to what a One Ring is doing, except it's not turned off by you can't draw cards clause. So yeah. I get that it's a lot more hoops to jump through, but it garnered ideas that I wouldn't have gotten to otherwise had I not gone back and thought, hey, this card is powerful in this context. Is there a way to update that with more powerful cards?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the point we're trying to make with this project is there's some value in looking at these old concepts and seeing what holds up and seeing what we can just throw out, right? So
yeah, it's inspiration.
About this book. This came out in, I think, 1995. Let's give it a quick look on the back here. Copyright 1996. So I think I got this on the Christmas of 1996.
Bro, 1996. For all you card gamers out there, that's the year Pokemon was released.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
One of the really cool things about this book, so this is Ice Age is out at this point, is that they go in the back of the book, every card that existed, a list of cards sorted by card type. We're not going to go over that. Oh, yeah. That's unnecessary. This was the first spreadsheet, basically, for, this was it. This is all the cards. And,
OG Scryfall, bro.
Yeah, it gave you everything you needed. And the nice little annotated index in the back, that's pretty nice. You can look up card utility, card economy, and find where those things are listed in the book. And that's the book
Zach,
is actually only this big.
Is card economy the one concept that no longer exists in a meaningful context?
I think it definitely still exists. Actually, card economy, the ability to like use cards and glean benefits out of them. I mean, let's take actually a look at the exact verbiage used to discuss card economy in the book. So we're not more than 2 paragraphs in, and the very first thing that I want to say before we talk about card economy, the very first lesson to be gleaned from this is if a format says you only need to play 60 cards, you should only play 60 cards. You shouldn't play more cards, which is something that I didn't know until I read this book in 1996. I was playing like 100 card monsters with like Leviathan and Polar Kraken, just every blue card I owned in one deck, So
you got to get those quests for Ula's Temple, my guy.
Yeah. So the concept that like you should play the minimum required amount of cards, was something that you still had to tell people back in the day, and we're recapping the basics, so it's something to think about. So card economy. Let's talk about card economy, through the lens of Deep Magic, right? Card economy essentially describes the expenditures and advantages gained by the ease of each card, by the use of each card in a deck. In other words, good card economy is achieved when you glean numerous benefits out of a few cards.
So the reason that I ask is card economy as a valuable aspect to dissect valuable at all because every card now is so powerful and begets a card that looking at like does this card get a card is no longer as valuable. It's not only does this card get a card, but also how does it disrupt my opponent. So like every card that's good either is like the cantrips that filter for a card, or meaningfully begets a card and also meaningfully disrupts your opponent simultaneously, unless they're a combo piece.
Let's think about this through the lens of this book and then through the lens of now, right? In the lens of this book, probably the most economical card of its day was Balance, right? Balance in Type 2, Balance in Type 1. You cast Balance. If you're ahead, you probably don't cast Balance. But if you're behind, you cast Balance. You generally, your opponent loses a bunch of cards in hand, right? They lose all of their creatures probably because you're playing a situation where you're behind, right? And if you have something like a Zoran Orb or something like that, you can sacrifice all your lands and just reset the whole game, right? You're up five or six, 6 or 7 life or whatever from sacking lands to the Zoran Orb. Your opponent has lost all of their resources, their hand, all their creatures, and their land, right? So that's the card economy we're talking about. And if we were to take a card like Balance, which is not legal in Legacy, and port it to the now times, right? The card I would think that you would consider the most like economical of all the cards that you play is Terminus, because it does not a similar thing.
While I agree in the context of like what the cards do, which is simplifying the game state, the context in which Balance, like I think that they're and not to say that the value of card economy and the study of it isn't valuable, but the idea of if I Terminus a board now, I am likely down cards.
Yeah.
And by that, if let's say I sweep 3 or 4 creatures off my opponent's board with a single Terminus, I'm still likely down a card because the Terminus did not beget a card, but everything that they played likely did. So they have all at least exchanged evenly for each card that they've played. So everything was a +1. And even though Terminus in theory should have been a +4 or a +3 in that scenario, the Terminus itself not cantripping or in some way getting another resource means that I'm actually down a resource, which I think is part of why Terminus has lost value. Where it's like, if I had something like Balance these days, for those who have never played against a Balance, oh boy, it is an experience. You just go. I mean, what deck now would be the most dominant?
Well, just imagine your opponent
cast, right?
Like, I think 8 cast is probably the closest. Yeah,
all the Moxen.
Yeah,
the Moxen and the artifact, because it doesn't sack artifacts, so you can just go like Mox Diamond or Mox Opal or Lotus Petal or whatever and just cast Balance. Not him. Mind Twist your whole hand and like get rid of your entire board. You got nothing, and then it's like, oh man. I
Like the
gotta say, dude,
classic.
I don't have you. When was the last time you cast balance?
It wasn't too long ago because you can play it as a singleton in Vintage, and I was playing like a blue white red, like this was during Dreadhorde Arcanist, and you throw a balance into your deck if you're playing white because sometimes you top deck it in a situation where you're behind and you've mind twisted your opponent and
Dude,
Wrath of God at the board,
balance is so powerful. Of all of the cards that you have played in the last X number of years, what card makes you feel the most powerful wizard you've ever been?
Man, the most powerful I've ever felt. It's honestly, it's probably something from EDH.
Mm.
And it would be like I'm trying to think of the deck that I like. I like to play the most in EDH, and it's so hard. So Zeptothal is a mono green creature that like you enter the battles you enter combat, it doubles the power of all of your creatures, I believe. I have to double check that. But it's that's a really fun deck. It's been a minute since I played let's see. Here we go. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. So that's pretty powerful as far as like, in a casual format, it's a 7-mana card, but you're playing green, and in EDH playing green means you're ramping. Um I think honestly, if I were to think about one card that felt like that, and again, I'm gonna use the parlance of EDH for this, is actually Sauron the Dark Lord. Sauron the Dark Lord comes down. No one can really affect it on the board unless they wipe the entire board, and then
Yeah.
because you have 3 opponents, every time someone casts a spell, and people are often 2 and 3 spelling, all of a sudden you get back to your turn and you have like a 15/15 in play.
Yeah, I had to remember what Sauron the Dark Lord
Yeah.
was.
So
But yeah,
as a recap,
all the cards. Yeah.
as a recap, Sword of the Dark Lord is a 7/6 that has ward. Your opponent has to sacrifice a legendary creature or legendary artifact to target it at all, right? Then anytime someone casts a spell, you amass Orcs 1. Then if an Orc does combat damage to a player, you get tempted by the ring. Then if you get tempted by the ring, you can discard your hand and draw 4 cards. So that's a card that like is, I mean, especially like in the Ice Age times, is bonkers to even think about. But in a situation like EDH specifically, having 3 opponents, that card just feels bonkers. Like when you get back to your turn, if no one's dealt with your Orc army, someone's getting hit.
Yeah, an untouchable, and the most important thing in today's context for power level, it can be your commander, and that matters.
Yeah. So yeah, card economy. I mean, balance is just a wild card as far as a card economy, because in the decks that played it, it was Mind Twist, Armageddon, and Wrath of God all in one card for 2 mana. For 2 mana, which is absurd,
When I think of card economy now, I think of like the context that I try and think of it, if like particularly if we think about how balance operated. I think the most powerful aspect of any time I've ever cast a balance is it's probably the most powerful catch-up card ever.
Yeah,
right. Like
exactly.
from like no matter how far behind you are, balance can get the game back to parity or put you ahead. And I can't think of any card in modern times now that can swing a game back from being so far behind.
Like Living End, maybe, like
maybe Living End. Like I guess it depends. Like
when
Living
you
End,
cast your second Living End after the board's been wiped, I think that's like one of those situations. I don't know. Yeah, I think that it's tough because so few cards Plague Wind, like and so Plague Wind is where you want to be, but 2 mana Wrath the board is just wild, especially if and even if you're not wrathing the board. Let's say you're the Mahatma Jin deck, right? And your opponent has like 6 white weenie cards out, right? And you cast balance. maybe you discard a couple of cards, but now it's down to your opponent's White Knight and your Mahatma Jin, right? You're doing pretty good, and maybe you had to lose some lands, you know. But to be able to wipe the board and keep your best threat, that's pretty wild.
Yeah, I can't think of anything that is too analogous to it, but I guess that's why it's banned and everything and restricted to vintage.
Yeah. So the other important points that are gone over within that like first like whoa, Brando's over here catching flies. So the other cool point that they made was the concept of like fast mana, which we talk about a lot in Legacy, right? Like fast mana is a very important part of Legacy. Ancient Tomb, Chrome Mox, what have you. Understanding that like establishing early dominance is a very important part of the game, which we can certainly bring over to Legacy now. And then
if you want to read that one point in the paragraph where they dissect getting your mana, essentially like developing your mana as fast as possible, that I think is not only analogous to today, but is more important than it's ever been because of how powerful all the cards are to just like snowball the game out of hand. Where like back then, I mean, they equated Dark Ritual and Wild Growth, and it's like yes, those cards both get you are representative of fast mana, but like one is not like the other anymore.
So that sentence is the difference between being able to influence the game in the first two turns is typically the telling factor, since the ramifications of actions taken in early turns will have a greater impact later in the game. Like that we can bring over Legacy. That's great. Like we all know that, but it's a perfect like upon entering the game, upon entering the format, learning that was huge. And I think for me, the thing that I didn't understand, even after reading this, like I was 15, 16 when I got this book. I think even when reading this, the thing I didn't understand was that like a Mox Emerald is not just a $90 forest, $90 at the time. Obviously much more expensive now. I couldn't fathom a reason why I would want a Mox Emerald in my deck when I could just add another forest. But this, I
know that like I've heard the story of like, oh yeah, Mox Emerald is just a forest, and people would trade their Mox in for like Lord of the Pits or whatever back in the day. But like the context of which the fast mana mattered is so much different from then to now. So like it's not like everybody was an idiot back then. No. It's that the stuff that you were turboing out was the stuff that people would turbo out with the Moxen was so much more tame that like now anything that's turboed wins by itself.
Yeah.
But back then, like you were not there was no like auto win fast thing to do on for 2 or 3 mana. It's like you had like some cards that were objectively busted, but it's like so like Necropotence, but like that was off like Land Dark Ritual. You didn't need the Moxen for that, and if you did, like only Mox Jet helped you get there. So it's like there wasn't just like I've heard that story a bunch where people just like didn't recognize the value of Moxen, and I don't think that it's not like the Moxen weren't valuable. It's that the context in which their power level was significantly decreased because the stuff that they were powering out was infinitely more tame. Now every single card is a banger. Like the worlds we live in are just very different in terms of like how powerful fast mana is.
Well, I think, and we'll get to that spot when we talk about the concept of the fast creature deck, because they have two different versions of it. The small fast creature deck and the large fast creature deck, and the concept that like of what those what those analogous decks are now is vastly different than what they are in here. But that brings us to the next part of the book, is challenging the 5 basic decks, which to me is an interesting way to title that like subchapter. Challenging the 5 basic decks is basically telling you to put a battle box together. The authors are saying there are 5 decks that you need to be able to play against, and you have to have a plan against in order to achieve victory, right?
The way that's analogous to modern times, and when we go through the 5 decks, you'll probably be like, well, this is ridiculous. Like none of this stuff exists anymore.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. However, what does exist is the pillars of the format. And when they were saying the 5 types of deck that you have to prepare for, it's really analogous to when thinking of like what you're playing is how you're navigating either your deck has a specific problem, a la Zakon ACAT needs to be able to deal with Meltdown, or your deck needs to be able to have a plan against the other pillars of the format based on what you deem to be the ones that are worth respecting.
I think some of the really interesting stuff in here is actually the stuff that we can't carry over. For example, just to give you a quick rundown here, so there are 5 different kinds of decks. We have the fast creature deck, we have the burn deck, the hand destruction deck, then we have the land destruction deck, and the counterspell deck. So this is pre-combo. Combo decks didn't exist then. That happened in Mirage when we got our first like real combo deck, because otherwise it's Channel Fireball was the first real combo deck.
Yeah, what's the first actual combo deck that
that would be Cadaverous Bloom.
It's Cad Bloom, right? Yeah, it's I literally just I'm trying to assemble these pieces and the game ends.
Yeah, if you looked at Cadaverous Bloom as a person that would have been, for me, like I would have been 16 or 17 when that deck came out. If I would have looked at that deck without without knowing any of the knowledge I have currently, I could not have told you what the person was trying to do with
what
that
it
deck.
did.
I would have been like, I guess like they're just going to try and put enough lands into play that they're going to hit for a 4 land drain life, because I can't there's no way I could understand what was happening there.
Here's the thing, man. Anybody who wants a little trip down memory lane to to feel something, look at any of the old formats that don't. A good example that I'm thinking of in particular is pre-modern. I was looking at various decks for pre-modern, and I saw a Doomsday deck for pre-modern. Now, this Doomsday deck had 4.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, I was telling you about this.
I love this deck.
It had 4 future sight. I'm literally looking. It's obviously 4 Doomsday, 4 Dark Writ, like whatever cantrips you can get, and
Mox,
the
combo Lotus Petals and stuff. Yeah,
Lotus Petal, LED,
couple eggs,
all of the suspects that you think would be in your combo deck.
Yep.
But then the other cards that it had were Future Sight, 4x Future Sight.
Yep.
And then I'm like looking at the deck and I'm trying to figure out how does it win, because Oracle doesn't exist.
Yep.
It's not trying to combo with the Tendrils. I'm like looking for the win condition. And having played long enough, I recognize the win con has to be one of the cards that I don't know. And so I'm looking at the cards that in this one list that I was seeing. One of the cards was 1 Ebony Charm.
Yep.
And I'm like, I have no idea what Ebony Charm does, but I do know that it's how this deck kills somebody. And so I looked it up, and one of the 3 modes on Ebony Charm is target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life.
Yep.
And so the way that the deck actually kills is you would have a Future Sight in play in Doomsday with a bunch of LEDs, and then you would cycle everything back into your deck. You would cast the LEDs off the top.
Everything's off the top of the deck. Yeah.
That would give you enough black mana. So you would cast an Ebony Charm, gain a life, and drain your opponent for 1, which would ensure that you have at least 2 life, to then Doomsday again with a second Doomsday to flip all those cards right back in, and then just continue that loop forever. And I was like, now that is awesome. Like if that doesn't bring a smile to your face, that's how the deck wins. Like I mean, we've lost the thread if that doesn't bring you joy.
Yeah. So let's talk about the 5 different decks that they bring up, right? So first there's the fast creature deck, and first these decks, perhaps the most common is the fast creature deck. There are 2 kinds of fast creature decks. There is the small fast creature deck, so that's like White Weenie, which we could equate to how those people from 1996 would view Death and Taxes. It's not how we view Death and Taxes, for sure.
I think that like I don't think that in Legacy there is a fast creature deck, because there's nothing really analogous to that in my mind. However, in the younger formats, I think there definitely is.
Yeah.
Like,
well, yeah, I think every standard format has a red deck wins, right?
Right.
So I mean that's where you're
that's endured. Yeah.
So there's the fast creature deck that's small, and then there's the fast creature deck that's big, and back in the day that was turn 1 Soul Ring, and turn 2 Surrender Free, or turn 2 Urnham Jin, or like if you were a real baller, maybe you owned a Mox and you were like turn 1 Urnham Jin off of like a Mox and Mana Vault, right? Big deal getting off like a turn 2 like 4/5 something over Lightning Bolt range. was always the
Mhm.
plan. And that was the like big fast creature deck. Now the equivalent for Legacy now would be a show and tell deck, where like that is the concept, right? You're
Yeah, I mean,
cheating on mana to get a thing, right?
I actually think like it's like I guess show and tell could exist in that space. I always think of show and tell as like a combo as opposed to a big aggro deck, because the second that you go off, you've effectively won. But like I think that there might be a new space for that. You know, a deck that we covered recently, which is the like steel stompy deck playing Patchwork Automaton.
Yeah.
And like what we covered, like I think we covered it 2 weeks ago. And it was a 4X Patchwork deck that just like and like Lodestone Golem and that type of deal. I think that's probably the most prominent recent type of deck that's actually trying to put really thick creatures and bring the beatdowns, as opposed to like an I win button in the deck. Like, it doesn't have an I win button in the deck. It has some amount of disruption and very thick creatures, and it just tries to get you dead. And it like the way that it wins is actually getting your life total to 0.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing, so before we were mentioning about how like getting down like a big creature like that was a big deal. But the thing that I wanted to bring up is how often you turn 2 and earn them Jin, and it's immediately followed up with a Swords to Plowshares, and then you're just sitting there taking 1 damage for the next like 4 or 5 turns from a mana vault. So there's a huge liability in this strategy. Although it was insanely popular, there was a deck called Earn 'em Burn 'em at the time that was basically just like slam and Earn 'em Jin, cast Lightning Bolt and Incinerate at your opponent, and like get the game over. It even played like Fireball or something like that, I think.
So classic story about Swords to Plowshares. One time, a friend of mine, he was playing Miracles back in the olden days, and his opponent cast a Marin of Clan Nel Toth against him. And this is back when Commander product was still relatively in the early days of WotC like dedicating cards to it. And so, Marin has like experience counters and does a bunch of stuff, and it's like very clearly intended for 4-player, whatever. But his opponent casts it, and he goes, "I don't know what that does. What does that do?" And his opponent gets really, really excited to explain what Marin of Clan Nel Toth does.
Yep.
And right as the opponent is about to like go into like all this wonderful excitement about what this card does, and like it's so great, my buddy goes, "All right, whatever, dude, just swords it."
Swords.
And he swords it. And that was
I don't have any time for
that. that is the best embodiment of Swords to Plowshares that I can. Yeah. It's like, whatever, dude, just swords it.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, speaking of walls of text, Earn 'em Jin is a wall of text as well. That was a card that, again, like before reading this book and really like rocking, like before like the Magic Worlds Pro Tour on ESPN, which I have a copy of on VHS that I need to get like changed. That would be a fun thing for us to do one day, is to like just commentate over that. So before I understood the concept that like paying life for cards is fine, that was something I didn't understand as a kid. And like a classic example of that, the story everyone's heard, is InQuest magazine rated Necropotence as the worst card in Ice Age. Because like people just didn't think that like paying life for cards was a good idea.
And also there's again, that's also, I think, contextually that sounds idiotic now. But back then, I mean, that's something that is even discussed in pre-modern to this day, where the card pool is fixed, right? Yeah. It's like right now, Necropotence is on the ban list in pre-modern, right? Where the card pool does not change. It is a fixed set of cards. But there's the argument that if it came off, it wouldn't necessarily be that dangerous, because there isn't really a way to kill, right?
Yeah,
like,
no, there's
you
not
can
like
play it, draw 14 cards, but then there isn't like there isn't cards within the pool of cards available to construct like obvious, like nowadays, obviously, if you can necro and just draw 14, the game just is going to end the second you untap, because like, why would you not be able to kill your opponent if you have access to that many cards? But when the card pool back then, when necro was actually released, not necessarily, like it's not obvious what that kill would look like. It's like what you were talking about with Cav Bloom. It's like, if you think about Cav Bloom now, like try and make a Cav Bloom now. Back then it killed on what, like turn 6, turn 7, maybe turn 5.
You could do turn 3 if you were lucky.
if you have the Nutter Butter God draw
Yeah.
and your opponent doesn't interact with you at all,
You
then you
literally
can
have to
maybe
go
turn
like
3.
land, pass, squatter resources, pass, and then like cadaverous bloom, hoping that you literally drew an island, a swamp, and a forest. Right? You have that 1 mana left. You pitch your whole hand, and you pray to God that if you have a natural balance, that like you can get blue mana again to like do the thing you need to do. Right? Like because you need more than one prosperity to like get there.
And even back then, that means that your opponent didn't duress you, didn't have a counter spell up, didn't have some sort of disenchant effect. Like all of the things have to go right in that context, right? Where it's like now there are decks that will just kill you on 1. Like, of course, like that is.
I mean,
you know,
there were
a new concept,
were 1 turn kill decks in Vintage at the time, type 1 at the time, but you know that was Channel and Fireball. Like you had to literally have those 2 cards in your opener. So the thing going back to the Urnham Jin thing is the wall of text is like the concept that like a card had a drawback on it and then was still very good was not something I completely understood. I remember asking somebody at my LGS like who was trading them from me because they were in Chronicles. I was like, why does everybody want this card? It doesn't seem that good. It's like it's a 4 mana 4/5 that like your opponent gets to swing through with something. You're obviously going to be playing forests. And when they explained to me like, normally you get to choose what the thing is, so normally you give it to like a Birds of Paradise or something like that. Or maybe you're not playing forests. Maybe you played a City of Brass to get that out, so the drawback's unnecessary. Or like you're not blocking with Urnham Jin, you're attacking. So like it didn't matter that they got Forest Walk. Those concepts were completely foreign to me at the time, and I think they were foreign to a lot of people who were reading this book at the same time too. I almost feel like there's this great 18th century YouTube channel called The Townsends, where the guy, the whole thing is savoring the flavors of aroma of the 18th century, right? Going back to the 1700s and talking about like making apple pie and stuff. And a lot of the things he does is like he takes like recipe books from back in the day and then talks about them and says like, this is what these people were thinking at the time. And I kind of feel like that with this, where I feel like, getting into the mind of a player in 1996, like we would dominate it, like with what we know now, we would dominate in 1996. Deck building has like evolved beyond what they were even thinking in a book like this. This was high concept at the time, and this was only 3 years after the game came out.
And also, like, it's one of those things where, like, stuff has evolved, but all the stuff that it evolved from, it's standing on the shoulders of giants for sure. I mean, last episode when we were talking to Legacy Gambit, we were talking about the sort of things that you can learn from studying chess and how that can apply to Magic.
That's exactly where we came up with this.
Yeah, it's like if you're a competitive chess player and you were studying games that took place in the 70s and 80s, it's like back then they didn't have like Stockfish or other supercomputers that were able to analyze openings as well. So it's like maybe stuff back then it's like it looks amateurish to something that nowadays, but it's like you never got to where we got nowadays if it wasn't the developments that came along the way. So it's like this stuff seems elementary now, but it can still be informative, particularly if you're sort of lost in your deck building or something is you feel like there's a sticking point that you're not able to break through. It's nice to go back to the basics to remember being like, what am I overlooking? What am I not thinking? Am I getting too in the weeds? Sometimes simplifying is actually the way to go.
I won't spend too much time on this, but the second deck you should be prepared to face is a burn deck. At the time, Phil, a burn deck in Type 1, because there was no Legacy, right, was Chain Lightning Bolt, and then like you kind of had to start looking at weird cards. Like Incinerate, sure, but then it's like, okay, like do I play Inferno?
Ball Lightning, bro.
Ball Lightning, of course. Like the concept of Sly, the concept of a mana curve did not exist yet. Like not like it does now. Like the Sly deck that like made waves in the Pro Tour came out the same year this book came out. So like the concept of like a literal mana curve did not exist. So that's something that like you have to take into account when we even talk about a burn deck, because there just weren't like Lava Spike didn't exist, right? Like there weren't a lot of great spells to choose to be considered a burn deck.
Whoa. I'm gonna argue with your your insinuation that Lava Spike is a good spell.
I mean, you're 100% correct, but like
Lava Spike sucks.
the next spell that they would have probably been using would have been like Psionic Blast. You know, like that Psionic Blast kills a Sarah Angel, which was a big deal, right?
Yeah.
So,
but also Psionic Blast is sweet.
Psionic Blast
Lava
is
Spike
rad.
sucks.
You know, actually, one of the funny things, and we'll talk about this because now we're on to the third deck type, which is Hand Destruction.
Bro, you know what I'm thinking of? Oh man, you know what Psionic Blast does? Psionic Blast kills fucking Minsk on the stack, bro.
So does Lightning Bolt.
Or not on the stack, with the trigger on the stack. Bro, Lava Spike doesn't though.
No. Yeah, so
Lava Spike doesn't do that. Lava Spike sucks.
The next the third deck type that you'll need to worry about is Hand Destruction. One of the cool things about this is that they talk about the popularity of this deck has increased recently because of the new edition of Fallen Empires and the card Hymn to Torak.
So that even though Hand Destruction is a weird way to put a discard deck, you actually do have to be prepared for that now because Grief Reanimate exists.
Grief, yeah, the scam decks, right? But the other funny part,
the scam decks are the discard decks.
The funny part of this thing is then they talk about these decks are some of the most powerful, right? However, they suffer against Psychic Purge. Psychic Purge, do you know what Psychic Purge is? Psychic Purge is a one blue mana spell that does 1 damage to target any target, I believe. But if it's discarded, it does 5 damage. So it's like the OG guerrilla tactics, right? That was the first card that like gave you some sort of play against a discard deck. So that's really funny. Unfortunately, Psychic Purge is not available in Type 2, so it's a very powerful deck. And that's like the backbone of Necropotence was actually like playing like Pump Knights and Black Knight, like playing Order of the Ebon Hand and Knight of Stromgold, and little, like weenie creatures, right? Backing it up with Necropotence to refill your hand and casting stuff like Hymn to Torak, Icequake, Sinkhole, stuff like that to try and like get your opponent to just be low on resources. So I guess technically,
you know what you just wait. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So I was gonna say, I guess technically the Necropotence deck of the day was kind of like a mix of small fast creature, land destruction, and hand disruption. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, like the early Delver, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You just made me think of another concept for the card economy and how it is sort of evolved in where like I think like the way that I was thinking about card economy. I remember for a long time, anytime there was a card that let you sort of exchange cards for other cards, a good example of that nowadays would be something like Dak Vaden, right?
Sure.
Where it's like, yeah, I draw 2, discard 2, and if there was any way that you could recoup any amount of just raw cardboard, that it would then be converted into more resources or higher value resources. So things like Life from the Loam or Squee Goblin Nabob, right? Where it's like that now something along the lines of like a Squee in modern day Legacy is laughably underpowered. Even though it's effectively you draw a card every turn because it comes back into your hand out of your graveyard that you could then use to convert into other cards. The card economy now is the opportunity cost of a card in your deck.
Yeah. Well, there is a card like that in this era of Magic, and that card is Brain Geyser. You played Brain Geyser to recoup a bunch of cards. It's doing the same thing as Squee is basically. But you had to worry about counterspells and stuff. If you were going that long in the game, you were probably playing against a counterspell deck as well. So you had to be very cognizant of that. And it's played in the old school format. When you get to Brain Geyser for like 5 or 6, it feels super powerful, and the game is almost always over if it resolves. All right, so the last 2 basic deck types are Land Destruction and the Counterspell deck. So Land Destruction's ability to prevent opponents from developing their deck tends to allow its controller time to front an unopposed offense. So that's something we see in like the low resource decks, like the tempo style decks, like Legacy like Delver and stuff like that, where you can
mana denial,
just mana denial your opponent out of the game and be like, like I think Sarah said last week, like my 1 and 2 mana game is better than your 1 and 2 mana game, right?
Mhm.
But during this, you had Strip Mine, and then you had like Stone Rain, Sinkhole, Ice Storm. That was all like in Type 1, and in Type 2, you had like Thermokarst and Icequake were your other options.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
then
there was a very common effect.
yeah, and then so then the last type of deck, and the one that, like I think is the most worth talking about because it exists, but not in the way that it did then, is the counterspell deck. And basically, they're just the counterspell deck talks about you have to have an early presence of defense, and then like at the end of the game, you're just unstoppable because you're able to just stop your opponent from doing whatever they want to do after you stabilize, obviously. And so what it says about counterspell decks is these decks rely upon stopping you from casting spells basically on a 1-for-1 card basis, which obviously wouldn't play very well now. And although these decks are extremely powerful, they're typically limited in removal once a card has been cast and uncountered. So, like, it's, like, once you've used up your Swords of Plowshares, right? If they play another creature and you didn't counter it, it's there until you cast Wrath of God, Like, so you had to... And that's the way things still are, I suppose. But we were very limited in the amount of removal that we had during this time, because most control decks, most counterspell decks were blue and white. You were playing Swords of Plowshares, you were playing some number of Wrath of Gods, and generally your finisher was Mahatma Jin or like Air Elemental. There wasn't like the concept of like Landstill, like playing Mishra's Factory for like the win, so you didn't have to like worry about like your opponent's creature removal until you were set up. Really didn't exist so much. As like that was just another card that was thrown into. It was either an early blocker that you threw in more limited formats like Type 2, or it was a card that insulated you against Wrath of God in your fast like small creature decks.
Yeah, yeah. I have no response.
No retort. So that's the first chapter. The second chapter is deck construction. So if you want to follow along with us, we're going to try and do this somewhat weekly. But if you want to follow along with us, I'll link like the Amazon page for this. Like I said, we're trying to reach out, and if you know how to get in touch with these guys, this is Charles Wolf and George H. Baxter. If you know how to get in touch with these guys, please help us out, because we would like to do an audiobook of this so that we can make it just much more accessible for everybody to follow along. And I think it'll be fun to go over like what Magic was like in 1996 and see what we can take away. See what we can take away strategy wise from that time.
Yeah, we talk a lot of theory on this podcast, and I think that if I would assume that the majority of our listeners are like us, as students of the game, and can really appreciate how all of the stuff that we talk about, how it was developed in the early days and how it's evolved over time.
Yeah.
And it's like the stuff that like it can sort of remind you of to like spawn new ideas is really prevalent. I mean, when we had this idea of starting this sort of series, just the early concepts and then going back and playing older formats, it really is like re-enlightening,
Yeah.
It's like, it's concepts that but it's like if you haven't thought about them in a long time in a meaningful way, it can sort of bring back a lot of things to the forefront of your mind that can inspire certain card choices or certain play patterns that you may not have thought of in a long time that might be fruitful. So if you're like us and you like studying the history, it'll be a fun series.
Yeah, I mean, there'll be plenty of Boomer Magic talk, of course. And I think the other interesting part of this is not just like the nostalgia and the strategy. It's looking at this and seeing what doesn't work anymore. There are a lot of concepts in this book. Like there's a spot where they talk about building a mana base where they're like 30% of your cards should be lands. It's like that's not a thing anymore. That's not how we build decks.
That's not
at all, because of just how deck construction has changed over time. Sometimes it's way more, sometimes it's way less. It just depends on the kind of deck that you're building. Depends on the format, obviously. But there's a lot of really cool, just like old stuff in here. There's also like I love when we get into the decks. The decks is going to be the funnest part, because like the Black Sea, it's a discard a discard deck and a counterspell deck. Like I think it plays. What do we got? like
it's the
pirate
earliest
ship
stage
or
of what does your
something.
deck do?
Yeah,
Man.
this is that. Yeah, Masonette's Amish deck. You know, like there's a lot of cool stuff. So there's only, let's see here. There's only about 15 chapters, which is, it's that much reading, guys. So it's not a ton of reading, and then it just goes into decks. And the fun part is going to be when we start talking about the decks, and that is a larger bulk of this. But I think that's like a cool place to check out. And if you're an old school or pre-modern fan, there's a lot of cool stuff in here for you. So, you know, if you get a chance, pick up a book. I'll try and like get a Amazon link for that. It was like $8, you know. So we'll see how that goes. We'll try and reach out to the authors and get some permission to do an audiobook for it. And that does it for us this week. Thanks everyone for watching. If you could like and subscribe this video, that'll tell us that this is something you want us to keep doing. And that does it for us. Have a good week, everybody.
Deuces.
If you're into this sort of content, you should check out our Legacy 101 playlist. There's a lot of great stuff in there. Have a good one. Thanks.